Welcome back, everyone. It's been a few seconds for me since I recorded the last recording, but it might have been a little longer for you. I know some of you like to binge watch these or binge listen to these, and I think that's kind of neat. I've done that stuff before too, so I can definitely relate to that. I don't know how you tolerate my voice, though. I mean, I have to listen to myself when I'm making these videos, and even when I'm talking, it's like, I don't know if I want to do that. But nonetheless, if you are here, thank you. Thank you for continuing this, and thank you for joining us in part two. Hopefully it goes by a little faster. So in this part of the lesson, we're talking about the death, burial, and resurrection of our great Rabbi, Yeshua of Nazareth. In our last lesson, we talked about what was Yeshua. We know that Yeshua not only was a Jew, but he is a Jew. In regards to ethical and legal matters, he was considered both a rabbi and a teacher. He's actually called this close to 50 times. So I don't think it's something that can be neglected. I think that that's really his primary role. The number of times that he's called the Messiah are actually very, very, very few. And so I think that whatever the Gospels emphasize the most, that's what we should also be emphasizing the most. It's again, I don't mean to be controversial. I'm just trying to keep it real. We know that Jesus affirmed the eternity of the Torah. He taught the Torah. He kept the Torah, and he taught his disciples that the law continued until heaven and earth pass away, which is basically never. There is a time after the Messianic age where it might happen, but it's debatable. Nobody actually knows what happens after the 1,000-year Messianic age or Messianic time frame. I think Isaiah says this: neither eye has seen nor ear has heard, right? But we can get a taste of it in the Messianic era. It's kind of like the peel of an orange, where there's flavor in the zest of the orange and it surrounds the orange, but the peel is not very thick compared to the rest of the orange. Or maybe the skin of an apple is better because the outside is thinner. But we see that Yeshua's main role as a teacher and rabbi was preaching repentance to his countrymen, and before he ascended into heaven, he told his disciples to go preach this same message that he was teaching Israel to the nations. The nations usually referred to Gentiles, but can also include the Jews that were living among them. We know that Jesus also taught and he stressed monotheism, and he says that this is the number one commandment. And we see that Paul and James also teach this as well. Not that other apostles don't, but we looked at two examples from them specifically. We then moved on to Jesus' time in Gethsemane. Why was he praying? Why were the disciples with him? And what was the arrest of Yeshua like? And what were the players in that? And then we talked briefly about the illegality of Yeshua's mock trial, and how, at least on 4 points, it was totally illegal, totally bogus. He should have never been convicted. And this is not me trying to stick up for him. This is me looking at the halacha, the Torah, the law of God as interpreted by the God-ordained judges, looking at the standards that they set up, and saying that the trial was totally bogus. So, without further ado, some of you might have just listened to that, so that was just a review. Without further ado, let's get into our lesson for today. So, who's responsible for Jesus' death? We touched on this briefly last time. We find that there's 3 main players, but we also see this 4th player, which we'll be getting into later on, after the Gethsemane event. And so we find, first of all, let's talk about the Sadducees. First of all, they hated the Pharisees, and by extension, Yeshua too. They hated Jesus for his criticism of the temple establishment, which was run by the Sadducees. And the Sadducees worked with, and sometimes worked for, the Romans. They were puppets of the Romans, and in fact, the Romans sometimes tried to staff the Sanhedrin with Sadducees, which was illegal, by the way, but more illegal activity by the Sadducees. They also claimed false charges against Jesus and made up stuff against him just to convict him. Apparently, to the Sadducees, lying was okay, even though the Torah says not to. We also see Judas. We can't talk about this without talking about Judas. He betrayed the master for a price, and without him, Yeshua may never have been killed. Right? We talked about last time, Yeshua didn't have to die. He didn't have a responsibility to die. He was not doomed to die. This is why he was praying in the garden, Father, if there's any other way, please, let's do that. I don't want to die. And who can blame him? I don't want to die. I'd prefer not to, but if it's God's will, it's going to happen sooner or later. So without Judas, Jesus may never have actually been killed. Now, there is a little bit of a redeeming event or redeeming quality, I guess. Judas regretted his decision. And unfortunately, he didn't deal with it the proper way. If Judas truly deep down regretted and wanted to repent, he might have tried to rescue Yeshua. He might have tried to, liberate him from prison or something like that. But he didn't do this. And I think that he's an example of somebody who regrets but doesn't repent. And so what he does, he feels bad, but he doesn't change. He feels bad and then commits suicide because perhaps he realizes what he did. And not to be too hard on him, because I think Luke says it would have been better if he had never been born. I understand that, but part of me does kind of feel bad for Judas, in the sense that he regrets what he did. He realized it was wrong. This was not just him putting on a show, and he regrets this in private. He returns the money, right? He's like, it isn't worth it. This is a big mistake. I don't want to be involved. He returns the money, and unfortunately, he deals with his regret very improperly by killing himself, which is against Torah law. And the rest is history. But just imagine if he would have actually not done that. He would have remained, the quote-unquote 12th apostle. He could have been, an apostle to the Gentiles. He could have been, this big name in church history, but he decided to go a different route. Now we also have the certain Pharisees who were calling for Yeshua's crucifixion. And again, these are not all 4,000 Pharisees and their supporters all across the country, right? These were almost certainly Beit Shammai Pharisees. Pharisees from the house of Shammai who didn't like Hillel Pharisees, usually. Sometimes there was some love and sometimes some peace. But around this time, there was still a lot of tension. And we know that Beit Shammai killed a number of the members of Beit Hillel. We covered that a few times ago, or a few lessons ago. And so it really doesn't surprise us that they're out to get another Hillel Pharisee, another Hillel rabbi. They also, just like the Sadducees, they claimed false charges against Yeshua. They actually proposed the method of his death, which was crucifixion, and they called for a release of a known criminal, someone who actually did break the law, to get rid of a rabbi that didn't break the law. They just interpreted it differently than Beit Shammai. Right? Why they did this, who knows? But it's not because, they're just evil people. But did they make a mistake? Sure they did. Was it a wicked decision? Sure it was. Did they regret it afterwards? Who knows? So I think that to judge them too harshly would be unfitting. However, they were pretty adamant about what they did. And knowing the nature of Beit Shammai, at least during that time, uh, some of them might have been rather bloodthirsty. Again, not all of them, but particular elements within Beit Shammai, maybe zealot faction within Beit Shammai. And I think it's even fair to say that maybe Yeshua was actually killed by zealots. To say that the zealots were the ones calling to crucify them, because zealots were known for killing fellow Jews. Now, oftentimes they would do it personally, but who's to say that they wouldn't actually utilize the government to do their dirty work for them? Which then leads us into our fourth accomplice, which was the Romans, who actually did the kidnapping of Jesus, brought him to the high priest's house to conduct the phony trial, the illegal night trial. They were the ones who did the bidding of the Sadducees, and they were the ones who actually performed the actual execution. So without them, Yeshua might not have ever been killed. Right? He might have been roughed up. He might have been killed by mob violence. But the Romans are the one that are, I would say, possibly mostly responsible for the death. The Sadducees are mostly responsible, I would say, for the kidnapping, for the arrest. But ultimately, the Romans chose to kill him. The Jewish leaders at the time had no authority to put people to death. So they tried to go through the Romans. The Romans could have said, no, we don't want to. But they chose to do it. And so ultimately, at least in my own opinion, I ascribe to them the most guilt. And I think that there's actually a basis for this, because Yeshua himself says that he will be crucified at the hands of the Gentiles. He doesn't say the hands of the Sadducees, or the hands of the Pharisees, the hands of Judas, or anyone else. He says that he will be killed by the Gentiles. And so I take that at face value, I guess. In Matthew 20, verses 18 through 19, he says this, that the Romans are at fault. They're the ones who are responsible, or at least mostly responsible. Now, I thought about going through the science of crucifixion, in a sense, I guess you could call it, in describing where they would place the nails and the feet, and how a cross was structured. Sometimes it was a T, like a capital T. Sometimes it was a lowercase t. Sometimes it was like an I, where it was just a bar. All of these methods were used. What was Yeshua actually crucified on? Who knows and who cares, right? Some people say, oh, well, the cross is a pagan symbol, so it can't be a cross. Well, the Romans were pagans, and pagans used pagan symbols. So it's really not that hard to believe that they would have used something like this. So in terms of, by the way, I'm not going to go in this direction, but I thought I'd mention it at least. Now, in terms of why it was crucifixion typically used, why was it used? It was typically used against political enemies and terrorists who threatened the Pax Romana. The Pax Romana literally means the Roman peace, or it's basically the peace in the Roman Empire established by Augustus, Caesar Augustus, the adopted son of Julius Caesar. And the Roman Empire was actually pretty peaceful during this time, and the Romans were a little paranoid about this. They wanted to maintain it. And so whoever they thought might be starting trouble, they put down immediately and brutally. As to say, we don't know what you're doing, or maybe they did know what they were doing, but we want nothing to do with it. We're going to put you down. Don't even scare us with insurrection. We want peace. And unfortunately, although it was very brutal, it also very effective. But not for long. Because, you bully people enough, they're just going to snap. Now, what's interesting, other rabbis, other than Yeshua, were also tortured and murdered by the Romans. And we have examples in Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. There's the name Gamaliel again. Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha, HaKohen Gadol, who is the high priest. Kohen Gadol literally means the high priest. Rabbi Hanina ben Teradian. And these are just a list of a few of them. And there's also this story called The Story of the Ten Martyrs that's read on Yom Kippur, which, interestingly enough, is the Day of Atonement. We're talking about martyrs during the Day of Atonement, as if they were a sacrifice, maybe. This story of the 10 martyrs, of which I think Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, and Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha, I think that these men are mentioned. I'm not totally sure, but I know that this is read on Yom Kippur, and I think it's just kind of interesting that if Yeshua had not acquired a bad name because of the actions and teachings of certain so-called Gentile followers, then perhaps he would have been included in this story as one of these great rabbis who had been murdered at the hands of the Romans. At least for Rabbi Akiva, an example of this, he was wrapped up in a Torah scroll, and he was drenched and lit on fire. That's a big deal, right? People raked the flesh of these rabbis. They burned them alive. They tore them apart. And what does Rabbi Akiva have to say when he's being burned alive after being tortured? Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And his disciples ask him, why are you reciting this Shema when you're dying? What does Yeshua say? Yeshua says that this is the most important commandment. And Rabbi Akiva is reminding himself of this as he's being burned alive by the Romans. And he explains to his students that this is not only the most important commandment, but he wants to die proclaiming that there's only one God in the world. There's not 20. There's not 100 or 1,000,000. It is an act of defiance against Rome, the Roman system of paganism, and the Roman gods. Now, if we remember from our lesson on Julius Caesar, the Romans worshipped a group of 3 deities. Yeshua and Rabbi Akiva says that there's one, and Rabbi Akiva goes to his death proclaiming the God of Jesus. As Yeshua would say, the only true God. Now, moving on, we see in the upper left-hand corner what I have labeled the fake glamorized crucifixions from the Renaissance imagination. This is total fantasy. And I don't mean to be too hard, but this really is just total fantasy. The crucifixion didn't look like this. There was not an elbow-to-elbow crowd. There was not, this glorious scene. People weren't wearing diapers. It's... Yeshua didn't have light shining out of his face. It wasn't good weather. It looks like good weather, at least. Maybe a little cloudy. But in the bottom right-hand corner, we see real photographs of real crucifixion of Armenian girls during the Turkish genocide of Armenians from 1915 to 1917. The Turks were they were the remnant of the Islamic Caliphate. The Caliphate being the basically Islamic government that has Islamic law. This was 100 years ago. This wasn't like 2,000 years ago. This is within our great-grandparents' lifetimes, or their memories, or thereabout, right? As of the recording of this video, it's February 2017. This happened from 1915 to 1917. This is very recent. This happened during World War I. This is what real crucifixion is like. It's brutal and disgusting and horrifying. There is nothing glorious about it. There is nothing wonderful about it. It is totally gruesome. And these poor women are evidence of that. Now, these Muslims were probably undoubtedly inspired by the Christian symbol, by the cross, and saying, oh, if you love it so much, then how about we kill you by that means? Who knows? But I think something that's also important to bring to mind is that the New Testament, going back to this picture in the upper left-hand corner, the New Testament doesn't actually say that there was 3 people, or 2 other guys, one to the left and one to the right of Yeshua. It says that there was one to the left and one to the right, but it's not limited to 3 people total. It doesn't say there was only 3, and it doesn't say that Yeshua was right in the middle of the action, but that's how it's usually portrayed. Right? There could have been 20 people, and Jesus was not necessarily in the middle of the group. This is just something that exists in our imagination because of, usually, Renaissance era art, which happened 500 years ago. The New Testament doesn't specify almost anything about the environment that Jesus was murdered in. All we know is that there was a hill, there was some other guys, at least 2, there was a crowd, and the Romans killed him. That's it. And of course, there are details within those points. Now, were there 100? Were there 5? Who knows? The Romans had a habit of crucifying many people at once. It wasn't just 1 or 2 here and there. Maybe in the early days, but as time went on, you would sometimes see the road, going from one city to the next, lined with crosses from one city to the next. And that's more than just 3 people. Right? There could have been 100 people. Who knows? But I think it's important to kind of get rid of these imaginations, because I think that we see this event in a very legendary, almost glamorized Hollywood kind of scene where Yeshua's in the middle, the wind is blowing, there's the light coming out of somewhere, and this didn't happen though. Or if it did happen, it's not actually recorded in the New Testament. Now, were there miraculous events that were happening afterwards, like an earthquake and so on? Yeah. Which, oddly enough, usually that's not depicted in these pictures. But, you figure if you're going to depict anything, then you do that. Now, we'll get to the pictures in this next slide, but not quite yet. In Deuteronomy 21:23, God says, his body shall not remain all night on the tree. This is not talking about Yeshua, by the way. It's just talking about people in general. If they're hanged or crucified or what have you, if they're killed with basically a wooden object, not a club, but like they're killed on a piece of wood, whether it's a tree or what have you, his body shall not remain all night on the tree or the wood, but you shall bury him the same day. For a hanged man is cursed by God. You shall not defile your land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. And so by getting Yeshua's body down from off the tree, they were keeping the Torah. They weren't doing it just because, for later Christian interpreters to make up some kind of commentary. They were doing it because God said so. They were doing it because it says so in the Torah. So let's just have a rundown of Jesus' burial, right? We just saw Yeshua be crucified. What do we do now? So who's involved? Well, Yeshua is involved. Jesus is involved. What? Burial by enshroudment. This is the typical manner of burial in the Jewish world. And it actually still is this way, where you wrap somebody up in a blanket, basically, and you lay them in the ground. Sometimes you might put them in a very simple wooden coffin, but coffins were not typically used because, maybe it had to deal with when you're resurrected, how are you going to get out of the coffin, right? Or maybe that's just, me. I don't know. Where? A tomb relatively nearby the crucifixion site, right? They had to get there quickly. It couldn't be across town. It couldn't be in Galilee. It couldn't be, China somewhere. They had to get to it quickly. So it was certainly in or around Jerusalem. Which, by the way, when people were transporting Yeshua's body, they would become defiled, because that's just simply what happens when you touch a corpse, or when you come in near contact with a corpse, or when you get near a corpse. This is the Torah. It doesn't mean that Yeshua was unclean in a spiritual sense. It just means his corpse was unclean. All corpses are unclean. And so Joseph of Arimathea and the Romans and Nicodemus, or the Romans, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, they would have been ritually unclean, which sucked because maybe they had to run to the mikveh real quick and immerse to become clean for Passover. We're not actually given those details, just because that's not the point of the story. And usually, it's something I like to remind people is, in the Gospels, we're given the story for what's important for the story, right? We're not usually just given random details that make no sense within the context. So if it's written, it's probably important. So, when did it happen? It happened right before sundown, in preparation for Passover, which is treated like the Sabbath. There's most of the same restrictions and most of the same obligations. It's a little bit more lenient, but it's basically like the Sabbath. Now, why? Right, we're covering who, what, where, when. Why? Well, it's against the Torah to leave a corpse out in the open. There was not only certain superstitions about this, but also God commanded us to do it. Right? There's really no negotiating with that. God said to do it, so we do it. So, certain burial honors must be performed. And Joseph of Arimathea, who was a member of the Sanhedrin, who was not invited to the trial, and Nicodemus, who was also a Pharisee and member of the Sanhedrin, he was also not invited to the trial. So they probably knew nothing about it at this point. Now, how? Like I just said, these two guys, Joseph and Nicodemus, who were Pharisees, they weren't invited to the trial. And they did this because they were supporters of Jesus, and they were Pharisees. They were part of the Sanhedrin. And I'm not just making this up. This is what it says in the text. We're just reading the text here, right? We're not making up things. Some translations will say council instead of Sanhedrin, but the word for council in Aramaic is Sanhedrin. It's the same word for court, right? So some translations will say court or council or Sanhedrin or what have you. But it's also why they weren't invited, is because they did support Yeshua, and maybe the high priest knew about this. Even though Nicodemus went to Yeshua at night, maybe the word got out, or maybe the high priest says, they're a little cozy with the Nazarenes. I don't know if we should invite them. So I found some interesting information on from the JewishVirtualLibrary.org regarding ancient burial practices, as the URL implies. We read, it says, Jewish custom insists on proper burial as a matter of respect for the dead, a consideration of particular relevance in hot climates. Why? Because you leave a body out in the hot climate, it's going to rot and it's going to stink. So you need to take care of the dead quickly, so they don't get stinky and attract disease and flies and such. According to one Kabbalistic source, burial refreshes the soul of the deceased, and only after burial will it be admitted to God's presence. So maybe this is what they were thinking. Maybe they had to get Yeshua in the grave so that he could quickly be connected with God in a way that you can't when you're in a body. so that you could enter God's presence. And it's implied, potentially in the text, depends on your interpretation, that maybe Yeshua did go to heaven for a little bit, and then came back down, and then reascended in a bodily form 40 days later. It's possible. The precedents set by our prompt burials of Sarah the precedents, or the examples, the forerunners, set by prompt burials of Sarah in Genesis 23 and of Rachel, in Genesis 35:19, are reinforced by the Torah's expressed command that even the body of a man who has been hanged, right? This is the Deuteronomy verse. The body who has been hanged shall not remain upon the tree all night, but thou shalt surely bury him the same day. Now, later on in the article, it says, the duty of burial, although primarily an obligation incumbent on the heirs, or the family of Yeshua, according to these sources, ultimately rests with the whole community. So, if the family doesn't bury them, it is the community's job to provide a tomb or a grave site or something. And wouldn't you have it? 2 rabbis volunteer to take care of Yeshua, and Yeshua's family is not taking care of the burial honors. Although we do see the Marys play a role, and they're getting some spices and perfumes, but they don't actually make it to the tomb before Shabbat, before the Sabbath. Let's see. Ultimately rests with the whole community. Okay. In Talmudic times, the communal fraternal societies, the Chevra Chadisha, or the holy societies, I guess what it might be called, or the holy group, for the burial of the dead evolved out of an appreciation of this duty. So, because the community has an obligation to bury people if their family doesn't, certain clubs, burial clubs, were formed that would take care of people's burials. You know, wouldn't it be neat if we had something like this in America, where if the family is too poor or something to take care of it, then the local burial club comes by and takes care of it for you? Wouldn't that be neat? Similarly, escorting the dead, especially a deceased scholar, to his last resting place is considered a great mitzvah, a great good deed. Notice what it says, escorting the dead, especially a deceased scholar. This is exactly what Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus are doing. They are escorting Yeshua, who is this big rabbi, to his resting place. But it's not actually his last resting place. But they didn't know that at that time. And it's a big mitzvah. A mitzvah is a good deed. It's a commandment. It's a very meritorious action. And it says, it's considered a great mitzvah, quote, the fruit of which a man enjoys in this world while the stock remains for him in the world to come. So basically, if you take care of people's burial honors, if you honor the dead, because the dead aren't going to know that you're honoring them, there's no payback from them. They can't say thank you. When you honor the dead, you will get rewards in this life and in the world to come. You're storing up treasure both in this life and in the world to come, and in the next life, and in heaven. So I just thought that was interesting. I actually just found that last night, and I thought that was pretty neat. It was interesting to learn that too. Now, the actual account of Jesus' burial. In John 19, similar accounts are in the other Gospels, but I split it up just a little bit because there are some subtle differences that I want to address. In John 19, beginning in verse 38, it says, later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Yeshua. Now Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, because he feared the Jewish leaders. So basically he feared the high priest and the Sadducean element within the Sanhedrin. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. By the way, when people say that the wise men brought gifts for Jesus' burial, that is pure Christian speculation. The literal gifts that Yeshua was given at his birth were not being used. Right? They weren't being used because, as it says, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, they brought their own stuff. So I just wanted to make a point out of that. But anyways, taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with a shroud, right, with this burial cloth. They wrapped it with spices and strips of linen. So we see this burial process, and it's actually similar to mummification. I know that sounds kind of strange, but Yeshua underwent a process that was similar to mummification, just not quite the same. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with spices and strips of linen. This was in accordance with Jewish burial customs. At the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. Because it was the Jewish day of preparation, it was preparation day, the day right before a holiday or the Sabbath, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. So, I want to go back to our slide on Yeshua's burial, the who, what, where, when, why, how. And we see a picture of what's believed to be it's not believed to be the actual tomb, but it's a recreation of it. It's a model, I believe. And we see that there's the stone, you roll it over the entrance, and the entrance might have been, maybe 4 feet tall. You had to crouch to get in. Just because to make it taller would require more work. In the bottom left-hand corner, right on the left side of the slide, we find this diagram of Yeshua being laid in this shroud, or somebody being laid in a shroud. And this is the basic process by which a person was buried. We also have the controversial Shroud of Turin, which is in Italy. Some people, I really don't have any view on this, I just think it's interesting. Some people believe that the Shroud of Turin was the actual burial cloth by which Jesus was enshrouded. And when you scan it using some very sophisticated technology, you find an image in the cloth. It's the image of a man. It's the image of a bearded man, which we know Yeshua was a bearded man, according to Isaiah, I believe. And when the image is enhanced, and a little bit of artistic license is taken, in the bottom right-hand corner, this is maybe what Yeshua looked like. If this was actually his burial shroud, if this is the real deal, this is what Yeshua looked like. This is almost a photograph of what Yeshua looked like. And if this is real, which again, I don't know if it is, but if it is, this would be phenomenal. Now, again, doesn't mean you can worship the image just because it's Jesus. Doesn't mean anything. It just means that it's interesting. It's kind of, and if it is real, it's kind of neat to know what he looked like, right? It makes him maybe more personal. But I think it also looks different than the typical Caucasian, blue-eyed Jesus that we're all accustomed to, right? Now going back to our the burial spices slide. So we find that Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus had just put Yeshua in the tomb, and they had wrapped him up, and they had put some spices on him to get rid of the smell that would eventually take place. Now the women were also planning something very similar, but because it was late, they would have had to go out and buy all of these spices, and they didn't have time for that. So then, which begs the question, where did Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea get their spices? Well, Nicodemus, according to the Talmud, was very rich. One of the richest guys in Jerusalem. And in fact, he helped provide for the needs of Jerusalem, along with two other guys, the food, the wood, and something else, I forget. But he helped preserve the city for something like a year when the Romans were fighting the Jews. Later on. This is later on. But needless to say, Nicodemus was very, very rich. And maybe when they're talking about the rich young man, maybe it's talking about Nicodemus, who knows. But Nicodemus being so rich, he probably had stockpiles of some of this stuff ready. Maybe he was part of a burial society, who knows. He probably just had some at his house. They went to his house and got it, right? And then they rushed back to bury their rabbi. They didn't have to wait any long lines waiting to buy it. They just had to run to their house, get it, and run back. They had to run because it was almost Passover. And you can't bury people and embalm people on Passover. It's against the Torah. So in Luke, we pick up at the same spot, but Luke adds a little bit of information here. He says, the women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed along with Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea to bury Yeshua, or to entomb him, technically. They had followed along and observed the tomb and how his body was placed. Right? So they see Yeshua actually put in the tomb. They watch this happen. Then they returned and prepared spices and perfumes. This is afterwards, though. It's not they saw it and then they came back, and then it was the Sabbath. There's a little bit of chronology issues right here. Because when it says then, it's simply saying subsequently. Subsequently, after they had seen his body, then they buried him. It's a matter of order. Meaning they saw the tomb, or they saw him put in the tomb, and then they took care of the spices and perfumes. But Luke adds, and they rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment. So clearly, no matter what people say, the disciples still thought and still believed and still practiced observing the Sabbath according to the commandment. That's just what Luke says. Now what's interesting is that the women waited after the Sabbath to bring spices and perfumes. In the Mishnah, which is the compendium and the collection of oral law, and the rulings of the judges that God had ordained, in the Mishnah, it says, a woman may not go out on the Sabbath with a needle that has an eye in it, or with a ring that bears a seal, this is to do business, or with a cochlea brooch, or with a spice box, or with a perfume flask. And if she went out with these things, she is liable to a sin offering. So says Rabbi Meir. But the sages, permit a spice box or perfume flask. So basically, either way, you can take the stringent or conservative opinion of Rabbi Meir, or you can take the majority opinion, the accepted halakha of the sages, which permit a spice box and perfume flask. Either way, the women were obeying the Torah. And I find it really so interesting that it specifically says spices and perfumes. And in the Mishnah, in that order, it says spice box and perfume flask. That's really cool to me. I was excited when I found that. Well, that was a while ago, though. But it appears not only are they keeping the Torah, but they're actually keeping the more stringent opinion by waiting till after the Sabbath to carry the spices and perfumes. So it appears that they're actually going in accordance with Rabbi Meir. So this is interesting because in Matthew 5:20, as we read in the previous section, the previous part of this lesson, Yeshua says, your righteousness has to surpass the scribes and Pharisees. The scribes and Pharisees said that, it says, but the sages, the scribes and Pharisees, Chazal, as they're collectively known, permit a spice box or perfume flask, right? It's okay to carry these things around. on the Sabbath, assuming that you're walking around within an eruv. An eruv just is it's a boundary marker. I don't want to get into it, but it's complicated. But Rabbi Meir says, no, you can't do that. Now, the women seem to be taking the stricter opinion, right? The stricter legal opinion. Why are they doing this? Well, perhaps because Yeshua says in Matthew 5:20 that your righteousness has to surpass the scribes and Pharisees. Now, if the scribes and Pharisees said that you can do it, the women are saying, no, that's okay. We prefer to be strict. We don't want to do this. Rabbi Meir says that we can't, and so we're going to stick with him. Now, Rabbi Meir might not have even been born yet, but it's the same idea. It's the same idea that he chose the strict opinion, but the majority chose a more liberal opinion. And the women here actually take the very conservative opinion. So, this is our last slide, actually, for this part. Jesus' resurrection and ascension. What's interesting is that phrase of 3 days, and this is kind of hotly debated in the Hebrew roots movement and the Messianic movement and all these similar Torah movements. People say, well, he couldn't have died on Friday and rose on Sunday because it says 3 days, and that's Friday to Sunday is like a day and a half. And so when it says 3 days biblically can actually refer to the perfect timing of something. It doesn't actually refer to 3 literal days, like a 72-hour period. It's all throughout the Torah. I think that 3 days is associated with Abraham's journey to the mountain to sacrifice Isaac. At various other places, you can actually get on blueletterbible.com or .org, whatever it is, and do the search function, and you can search for the phrase 3 days, and it'll show you all the places in the Tanakh where it mentions 3 days. It's pretty neat. Or, the second opinion is that it was a literal 72-hour period. And if this is the case, he could not have died on Friday and rose on Sunday. So, again, opinion alert, this is my opinion. My opinion is that because it does say that he died that he resurrected on the first day, you can count back 3 days, which means that he might have died on Wednesday afternoon, been buried Wednesday evening, and in the grave by sundown, which sundown on Wednesday becomes Thursday. That's just the biblical Jewish, biblical Hebrew way of looking at dating and the calendar. And so he would have been in the grave Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, which that's a literal 72-hour period, and then resurrected after Shabbat on Friday night. After Shabbat, so once sundown comes, at 7, 8 o'clock at night, at that time, right after then, he could have been resurrected. In biblical timing, the next day starts at the previous day's sundown. So, for example, the first day actually started Saturday night. I know it's confusing, but this is just the biblical way of looking at the calendar. We treat the new day as starting at midnight, just because that's the Roman system. And we inherited that, and so we think of that in terms of the Roman method. There's also, in Jewish tradition, it says that God won't abandon his servants beyond 3 days. That without God constantly intervening without his presence, that a person cannot live for more than 3 days. Or it's something along those lines. And so I just find it interesting. And I think it's based off of something in the Psalms. But I find it interesting that in Jewish tradition, God won't abandon you for beyond 3 days. And wouldn't you have it, Yeshua resurrects after 3 days. So when the women find the tomb before sunrise, the tomb is already empty. I think this is something that a lot of people miss. Jesus didn't resurrect Sunday morning. It says that before the sun was up, before sunrise, so, 5 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning maybe, By the way, people in ancient times used to wake up in the middle of the night. And this is why the rabbis could mandate or suggest that you get up at midnight and pray. Well, how do you force your body to get up at midnight? Well, it's because people would wake up in the middle of the night. They might go to bed at, 7 or 8 o'clock, depending on the time of year. Wake up in the middle of the night and stay up for an hour and go back to sleep. Because there's a lot of darkness and you can't do a lot when it's dark. And so the women might have actually been getting up at midnight or 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. We don't know. But it was before the sun was up. We don't know exactly what time, but it was still dark. Meaning that Jesus was up before Sunday morning. Because when they got there, the tomb was already empty. So if they're coming in the middle of the night or very early in the morning and Yeshua's gone, then he left before that time, right? It's basic logic. So what's before the dark hours of Sunday morning? Late Saturday night. And so I think it's very possible. I'm not making any dogmatic statements here, but I think that it's very possible that Yeshua actually resurrected late Saturday night. Whether it's 9 or 10, 11, 12 o'clock, maybe even 1 in the morning, who knows. But it's all considered the first day to a Jew. So, he gets up, and people think that he's the gardener. He says, Mary. And Mary says, oh my gosh, it's Jesus. And she goes to hug him or grasp onto him, and he says, don't touch me. I haven't ascended to God yet. Or I haven't ascended to my Father and your Father, my God and your God, right? John 20. Why does he say this? What's interesting is because, first of all, men cannot touch married women, and married women cannot touch other men. So, and actually, men shouldn't be touching women that are not their wife, right? Unless it's your mother, your grandmother, your sister, your close relatives, but don't be touching people out in public. Why couldn't Yeshua touch the women? Because we know before, one woman wiped Yeshua's feet down with her hair, right? It's possible because Yeshua resurrected with a perfect body. And so with a perfect body, he couldn't have it defiled by a woman who, it's not that women are intrinsically unclean, it's just that women, when it's their time, during their period, they become unclean. And so if she was to touch Yeshua while she was unclean, then he would by extension become unclean and then could not ascend. Or something, I don't know. I don't know what would have happened if she did. Or maybe she just grabbed his clothes and he's like, whoa, don't touch me. Or maybe she was married. Who knows? But for some kind of reason, and there is some kind of moral, legal reason going on. What is it exactly? I don't know. But something like this seems to be the case. And then it says, Jesus ascends to the right side, or the right hand of God. What's interesting, this is in Mark 16. What's interesting, the right side denotes mercy, denotes kindness. And so this is kind of a reward or an act of kindness from God to Yeshua, saying, you have been perfect, you've been purified, come sit at my right hand, experience the reward. Now, here's just a question. Can God sit at his own right hand? Can God sit at the right hand of God? Just a question for you. Now, in Judaism, God's righteous right hand. This is a phrase that's actually mentioned 3 times every day when a Jew prays. It says, for the sake of your name, for the sake of your right hand, for the sake of your Torah, for the sake of your people, things like this. At the end of the Amidah, or the end of the Shemoneh Esrei. And Jews remind themselves of this concept 3 times every single day. And so this is something that's very familiar to them. And so I think that when they would read this and when they would understand this concept, they might understand this much differently than we do today. So I will leave you at that. It's been another hour. We just covered a few slides this time. Hopefully it's been educational and inspiring, and it's been helpful. Getting a little tired, but I think I might go on to record the third part here. So without further ado, thank you for getting to this point. Thank you for sticking with me. Hopefully this has been beneficial, and I hope that my voice is not sounding boring. I kind of feel like it is. But if it is, please let me know. I don't want to be a pain to you guys. But I guess without further ado, let's move on to part 3. Let's just get this. Let's get her done. Let's move on to the apostles and early Nazarene Judaism. So we'll see you in the next part.